Watson, Dr. Saho, and Dr. Navaroli for your support. So they evaluate the papers, and we selected 3 presenters this year. So we will have 3 presentations. I will be introducing their bio, and I gave out a handout for the abstract. So again, thank you for coming and taking time out of your day to support the student research. Francesca Madrid is a final year art history student with an interest in disability studies and accessibility in contemporary art. As a disabled woman of color, Francesca seeks to bring a different analysis and contribute to disability studies scholarship. Her career goal is to become an art curator at an accredited museum or gallery space, with an emphasis on making art more accessible for all people with different backgrounds. Last semester, she had a curatorial internship with the Orlando Museum of Art. Currently, she works as a curatorial intern for the Manila Museum of American Art under the UCF Jenkins Community Arts Scholars Program. In the next semester, she will continue to progress in her honors undergraduate thesis with her advisor, Dr. Carrie Watson, exploring art therapy and the representation of disability in the works of Frida Kahlo. Francesca plans to pursue a master's degree in art history post-graduation. So let's welcome Francesca.
Hello, and thank you. My name is Francesca and my paper is entitled Disability in Baroque Representation and Perception in Art. The Baroque period in the 17th century was considered the age of magnificence because of a greater expression of human emotion and thought. The Baroque welcomed many unique concepts and ideas in relation to art and architecture. It was the perfect time for experimentation amongst a primarily classical society, and it was an interesting pivot away from the more clear, harmonious, and balanced approach promoted in the Renaissance. The word Baroque is Spanish for barroco, which means a large and irregular pearl, and it is often associated with the description of strange, awkward, and bizarre. It makes sense why then so many kinds of people became valuable portrait subjects as society opened these new contemporary ideas following the Counter-Reformation of the Catholic Church. The idea was to use art as a means of teaching, persuading, and inspiring devotion. The goal of the Baroque is to relate to the ordinary class by displaying real portrayals of their experiences, including but not limited to people with disabilities that I will be discussing, arthrogryposis, dwarfism, and epilepsy. This paper explores how disabilities were seen and understood in relation to how they are displayed in art, emphasizing their humility to appeal to mankind's salvation that inevitably fueled the Catholic Church during the Counter-Reformation. In the 17th century, the Catholic Church became the largest patron of art at the time and pushed for a more real and emotional style to heighten relatability. This art style dominated and formed the Baroque period, which became a way to keep the faithful engaged after protests were made against the Church to reveal its corruption during the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation was an internal renewal of the Catholic Church following the Protestant Reformation that encouraged a rejection of Catholicism to restore its dominance of power. Catholics reaffirmed the use of art for inspirational purposes, while Protestants banned images in churches that encouraged idolatry or the worshiping of idols. The Baroque period that emerged during the Counter-Reformation was enabled as a strategy to keep the faithful engaged emotionally, visually, intellectually, and spiritually, which inevitably helped to align with the representation of disability. Artist Giuseppe Vela was a Spanish painter who spent his career in Italy, and his painting, The Club-Footed Boy, displayed a disabled Neapolitan beggar as the subject. The boy is shown with a deformed foot, and it has been suggested that he has hemiplegic cerebral palsy or arthrogryposis, among other diagnoses. During this time, the imperfect body was used as moral lessons while inspiring charitable acts. The disabled were symbolized as imperfect, corrupt, impure, and portrayed a sense of realism and human vulnerability. Consequences of perception and identity led to charitable acts towards imperfection that were encouraged amongst the society, referencing Christian obligation to guarantee salvation by giving alms to the poor and disabled. It is important to note that the disabled were understood and viewed to make the able-bodied superior, an intent to use them for their own gain towards the promise of salvation and lure believers towards Catholicism during its decline. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, physical impairment and suffering served to strengthen faith and view the disabled as an image of God. Rivera is a club-footed boy stands holding a crutch and cartelino, or small card, with words with his left hand which reads in Latin, "Give me alms for the love of God." This important card granted the boy permission to beg, as this was a requirement to beg legally. The cartelino was both a form of communication and a way to ensure one's safety and livelihood. People with disabilities were forced to fit this narrative and didn't get a chance to show their capabilities since they were seen as broken when compared to an able-bodied society. The act of begging was truly the only way for the disabled to make a living to survive, since they were viewed as incapable, to encourage pity and disgust, as society didn't accept or understand their physical or even mental differences. It only limited them further beyond what they could be capable of without knowing if it were ever possible. Based on how people with disabilities were viewed in the Baroque, they were never given a chance to prove to society differently. This painting was commissioned by a Flemish dealer, which is ironic because at the time, Flemish or Dutch painters often painted beggars or the disabled as buffoons. At least in Rivera's painting, the club-footed boy was painted with some form of dignity while still paying homage to societal expectations of the time. Disabilities are perceived on the way they are portrayed and displayed. These perceptions of the disabled are transferred through powerful idealists' inability to believe these kinds of people can live on their own, or even live at all for that matter. This shift in the narrative of societal contribution to the survival and livelihood of disabled bodies was a mediator in the soul's salvation. People with differences in their physicality emulates the broken body of Christ, and the imperfections bring them closer to God. I included a quote from Dr. Elena Colom's chapter, "The Broken Body as Devotional Mediator in 17th Century Spain." Physical impairment and the suffering of the body was also understood by the Church as a way of emulating Christ's passion. It served to strengthen one's faith in the redemptive sacrifice of Jesus. Charity therefore went hand in hand with the view of the disabled individual as an image of God. The connection between disability and God provides the ultimate metaphor for understanding the power of the images of the disabled as redemptive. The broken body of Christ emulates the disabled body, and vice versa. The next artist I will be discussing is Diego Rodriguez de Silva Velázquez, who also was a Spanish painter like Giuseppe de Rivera, who painted another kind of disability, dwarfism. Velázquez was an artist in the court of King Philip IV of Spain and Portugal. Throughout his career, he painted at least 10 portraits of dwarfs, noting their importance to the king. Historically, dwarfs were intimately connected to the divine, and ancient Egyptians associated dwarfs with Bes, the god of home, family, and childbirth. Because of their connection with the gods and being conduits to heaven, they were often allowed to serve high roles in the government. In 17th century Spain, Philip's entourage included at least 110 dwarfs, since he was weary of normal human contacts, because so much depended on his personal favor, could pamper a dwarf without arousing the envy of the courtiers, who were in constant attendance upon him during his peregrinations. A dwarf's life was irrelevant. Physically and/or mentally challenged individuals served the purpose not only of entertainment, but sometimes friendship and loyalty in a restricted society. Considered human ailments to ward off evil, people with dwarfism were frequently traded between courts. Velázquez's painting, Sebastian de Mora, a dwarf attendant in the court of Philip IV of Spain, requisitioned from the entourage of his younger brother, indicates a different viewing of a person with a disability, shown with more valor and dignity. De Mora is painted in bright, elegant clothing against a dark background, cuts a very dramatic figure, but it is his expression that most commands our attention and has often inspired critical analysis. His expression reveals his intelligence and assertiveness to encourage the viewer to take this person more seriously, to be viewed as a human being and not a toy the court wanted. Courts often view dwarfs not as people, but as possessions that were part of court splendor, akin to collected exotic animals, and Velázquez seemed to take a different approach than previous painters in the 16th and 17th century that reflected their cold attitude towards people with disabilities. He painted the handicapped as he did the royal family, with humanity conveying his own recognition that these unfortunate creatures were as human as their masters. He respected their dignity as human beings and delineated their individual personalities, which was a radical and historically significant approach to the perception of people with disabilities. Sebastian de Mora was commissioned by the king and portrays dwarfism as a disability that had a greater understanding and acceptance within their respective roles as society saw fit amongst the court. There was still a long wave of full acceptance, importance, and viewing of people with disabilities, even the less common ones, as real people, and not someone to be used for entertainment or selfish reasons like the enhancement of reputation or guarantee their place in heaven. The final artist I will be discussing is Gian Lorenzo Bernini, an Italian multidisciplinary artist deemed the greatest sculptor of the Baroque. I want to emphasize that the greatest sculpture of the Baroque period created a sculpture of a saint with a disability. The heavenly sculpture in the Cornaro Chapel in Rome, Italy, Ecstasy of St. Teresa, was by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, Teresa de Avila. The subject of the marble sculpture is one of the most beloved religious figures in history. She was a Spanish nun and one of the great mystics of the Roman Catholic Church and was canonized in 1622. Bernini's sculpture was commissioned by Cardinal Federico Cornaro, who was building his family's chapel in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. This work successfully depicted what the Counter-Reformation was trying to convey through art by the use of emotion and theatricality to arouse wonder and engagement to keep the faith in the church alive. Saint Teresa de Avila wrote about her life in spiritual writings, specifically referring to her autobiographical narrative, the Book of Her Life, where she conveyed better analyzation of her mystic experiences with religion and their glorified importance to the perception of disability. In the Book of Her Life, Teresa de Avila speaks of frequent corporal pains, convulsions, stomach problems, dizziness, loss of consciousness, and strong emotional fluctuations involving mystical graces, involuntary and uncontrollable raptures, beatific and diabolical visions, hearing voices and prophetic messages. Neurologists E. Carranza and J. Esteban Garcia Alvea and Pierre Vercelato suggest that, among other illnesses, Teresa de Avila suffered so-called ecstatic epilepsy as a result of a lesion in the temporal lobe. The quote from the Book of Her Life that inspired Bernini's sculpture is as follows. I saw in the hands a large golden dart, and at the end of the iron tip there appeared to be a little fire. It seemed to me this angel plunged the dart several times into my heart, and that it reached deep within me. When he drew it out, I thought he was carrying off with him the deepest part of me, and he left me all in fire with great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and the sweetness this greatest pain caused me was so superabundant that there is no desire capable of taking it away, nor is the soul content with less than God. The pain is not bodily but spiritual, although the body doesn't fail to share in some of it, and even a great deal. This shows evidence of her neurological condition when connecting her mystic visions to the characteristics her suffering and accepted that pain can be a source of personal power and expression, especially through the identification with the Passion of Christ. She was someone who identified with a disability, though she may not have been fully aware of it at the time, and she was valued for it to the highest level by becoming a saint. The sculptural interpretation of one of her visions, done by one of the greatest sculptors of the 17th century, Bernini, shows Saint Teresa in this new light and paves a path for relatability amongst others with physical or mental ailments. By bridging the gap of how society perceives disability and what the disabled are capable of based on their life perspectives and experiences. A reminder that though she suffered greatly, she was able to make something out of it and rewarded through the canonization for her immense dedication and passion to and for the Catholic Church. In the Baroque period, people with disabilities were displayed for a variety of reasons, like the attainment of salvation, charity purposes, or in awe of their experience. People who identify with a disability are often marginalized and simplified. We can confirm this upon further viewing of artworks in the 17th century that led to this conclusion. Through this analyzation of their representation, we can obtain a greater understanding of societal perception in relation to how they were valued and therefore they're displayed in art. Artists like Vela, Velázquez, and Bernini contribute and act as documenters of history within a modern society, showing subjects with disabilities in different ways while representing them with respect and dignity. This small act shares a glimpse into years of activism towards the ability to hold a higher regard for people who suffer and that proper treatment of them is possible. These artists remind a greater audience of the disabled as human regardless of their differences that may lead one to believe otherwise. There is a sense of value when comparing these paintings to handicapped individuals who inevitably are displayed to feel the church and people of power that maintain a superiority complex against them. Through this idea, we are then able to connect societal acceptance of the 17th century in Spain and Italy towards certain disabilities over others in relation to the reflection in their artwork. I have sought to contribute to the understanding of the overall complexity that individuals with ailments and differences, whether physical or mental, have the capability to expand ideas beyond the art that is in front of us, by immersing ourselves within the context and backgrounds behind the subjects. It can give us a further look into the lives of men during the Baroque and show appreciation and gratitude towards their individual experiences being represented in the work. I'd like to end with a takeaway for the importance of exploring disability representation in our history as a means of connection to a modern society. In this sense, disability is a story we tell about bodies. It is a received, reliable story that changes over time and across place. Representation structures rather than reflects reality. The way we imagine disability through images and narratives determines the shape of the material world, the distribution of resources, our relationships with one another, and our sense of ourselves.
Go ahead and introduce our next speaker. And we're going to call questions towards the end. Our next speaker is Sara Pagán Vela, is a second-year art history student with an interest in the multicultural and social political context of religious art. As a Puerto Rican, Sara seeks to further the formal scholarship of Puerto Rican artistic history, traditions, and culture. Her career goal is to work with museums as a conservator in order to preserve art for the enjoyment and education of future generations. Her first working experience at a museum was at Puerto Rico's Museo de Arte de Bayamón as a docent intern. Currently, she works as a collections and exhibitions intern for the Orlando Museum of Art under the UCF Jenkins Community Arts Scholars Program. In the coming summer semester, she will begin a progress towards her honors undergraduate thesis in art history and plans to pursue a master's degree in conservation post-graduation. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Sara Vela, and my paper is titled Between Divinity and Mankind, Intimacy and Religious Visionary Experience in the 17th Century Art. The restrictions placed upon sacred images by the Council of Trent resulted in great losses of culture, as countless works were left permanently altered or destroyed. Despite this, the Counter-Reformation's unique demand for propagandistic art led to the development of a radically new visual language among 17th century artists and their depictions of intimacy in religious art, particularly within scenes of visionary experience. When compared to the antecedent, key religious works of the Baroque may seem overly familiar, perhaps unrelenting, in their overt displays of affection between man and divinity. This conjunction of sensuality and sanctity was not born out of a belief or a desire to create controversy, but instead existed as a reflection of the thin line upon which artists of the Counter-Reformation were left to balance. They were tasked by patrons to create enrapturing Catholic propaganda, constrained by the Council of Trent's expectations of virtuosity, and all the while urged by the public's rapidly growing interest in naturalism, theatrics, and human psychology. The visual language developed from the convergence of these factors is demonstrated most clearly by the Baroque artist's rejection of Renaissance standards for illustrating contact between man and divine. These being distance, placidity, and composure, God is above and we are below. It was well born iconography that reflected the 15th century's religious and artistic philosophies of hierarchy. Conversely, the religious and artistic philosophies of Renaissance and Baroque were not experiments in most their heresy, but instead an artistic innovation in creating the world-shattering momentous of visionary experience, the moment in which divinity meets man, utilizing intimacy, sexuality, and physical proximity in order to engage the viewer's faith far beyond the literal and symbolic expression of the Renaissance. Seems like changing to a different PowerPoint, it kind of messed up, but it's okay. The Council of Trent origins trace back to 1517, when Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses and decried the institutional corruption that had festered in the Catholic Church. His revolutionary writings sparked the Reformation, driving hundreds of thousands to convert to Protestantism, which in turn began the Counter-Reformation. In 1545, the Council of Trent was officially formed and convened with the motive of defending their doctrine and answering to the criticism having levied against the Church, thereby attempting to revive Catholic faith in the masses. This was the 19th Ecumenical Council of the Catholic Church. The Ecumenical Council being a gathering of church authorities convoked by the Pope to respond to, discuss, and rule on doctrinal disputes. It was convoked by Pope Paul III in 1545. There's a little picture of Pope Paul III. The methodology behind this report is to utilize and still deliberate art, highly effective in society where most conducted in formal schooling, and therefore would not have been able to read scripture or understand Latin Mass. In the 25th session, the Council of Trent discussed the practical use of sacred images, not only because they were called to the triumphal benefits and gifts that have been granted to them by Christ, but also because they bring before the eyes of the faithful the miracles performed by God through the saints, and their edifying example, salutary example, so that the faithful may give thanks to God for them, and may pattern their lives and habits according to the example of the saints, and may be encouraged to adore and love God and practice piety. Alongside the inclusion of a larger audience, the Catholic Church needed to impress its infallibility upon the scorned and distrustful masses. Ever since the advent of the Counter-Reformation, stringent restrictions have been imposed upon the creation of religious imagery. It is with the Council of Trent that these standards are officially codified into law, decreeing that, quote, all lasciviousness be avoided, in such wise the figure shall not be painted or adorned with a beauty exciting to us. The Counter-Reformation standards of decorum, coupled with the Council of Trent's domineering program of ritual, brought about a period of sexual repression and whistleblowing in art, constricting artists regardless of their popularity. Thus, this left artists of the late 16th century caught between the Council's restrictions, their spiritual duty as Catholics, and the changing taste of the society which has slowly come to favor depth of feeling and drama over the previous century's mathematical order and ideality. These moral, legal, and artistic dilemmas saw particular conflict when it came to images of mortals receiving divine visions. Visionary experience had been a subject of interest to Catholic artists since long before the Baroque, but it is with the Baroque that there is a stark change in how these scenes are portrayed. During the Renaissance, mortals coming into contact with divinity were typically depicted as sinning and dirty. An example of this being Fra Angelico's Loathing tangere, or Don't Touch Me in Latin, from 1442. Here, Fra Angelico illustrates the moment in which a resurrected Christ appears in front of a weeping Mary Magdalene, asking that she not touch him before he completes the ascension to the Father. As written by Michel Lambert Montanel, Fra Angelico has a quote not entirely broken away from the medieval tradition by the time of having created this fresco, and then further elaborates on the early Renaissance characteristics of Roman liturgy. Quote, Christ's illuminated body and hovering stance just above the ground are deliberate attempts by the artist and monk to encourage contemplative thought on the world in his room at the Florentine monastery. The brightness of dawn and the detailed garden are depicted naturalistically, which reflects trends in Renaissance art. Fra Angelico depicts Christ in all his simplicity and glory, while the solid black of the cave's interior reminds the viewer of sin and death overcome by Christ. In accordance with early Renaissance conventions, Fra Angelico ensures that there is a clear division drawn between mankind and the divine. The separation between both figures invites awe in the face of Christ's magnificence in humanity, as it is his distance from mortality which denotes his holiness and status as a son of God. Even the choice of stories reveal it is no coincidence that this scene, a story in which the mortal Mary Magdalene cannot touch the heavenly Christ, was widespread during the Renaissance, yet waned in popularity during the Baroque. Known liturgy was depicted by numerous 16th century artists, such as Giotto di Mondoro, Correggio, Martin Schubel, Fra Bartolomeo, Bronzino, Hans Holbein the Younger, and Titian, due to the fact that, as a story, it is the Platonic ideal of Renaissance. Mary Magdalene's grief appealed to burgeoning humanist interests, yet it still featured an impermeable separation between mortality and immortality, the ephemeral and the eternal. In the separation between the body of Christ and the body of Mary Magdalene, knowing the tragedy conveys a sense of distance that was quintessential to the ideology of the Renaissance, yet made absolute its emotional detachment by the higher order. In the 1560s, the Council of Trent unanimously agreed that their crusade against heresy had come to a close, and it had likewise become necessary for the bishops to return to their, quote, flocks. By 1563, the Council of Trent had dissolved itself, but their systemic oppression would continue well into the 1600s, even as art had already begun to rapidly change. Caravaggio's struggle with his painting, St. Matthew and the Angel, embodies how, as the 16th century gave way to the 17th century, and Renaissance became Baroque, that the Catholic Church's conflicting interests continued to influence intimacy in religious art. With Caravaggio's own personal inspirations being drawn from, quote, the sacred and the profane, he is a shining example of an artist caught between his and the public's growing desire to explore the 17th century's nascent artistic philosophies, and his counter-reformationist paintings continue to want old-fashioned Renaissance values, etc. tendency. Caravaggio had always sought emotional profundity and naturalism in his work, and after receiving a commission for the contour of the chapel altarpiece, we can assume that he approached it the same as many of his other works. Vastly different from any previous depiction of this rare experience, his first version of St. Matthew and the Angel in 1602 has St. Matthew and the Angel sharing a space as equals, with the angel leaning into him as he delicately guides St. Matthew's right hand. Unlike previous depictions of the same subject matter, Caravaggio's work does not utilize the iconography a 17th century observer would tend to expect, such as rays of golden light, prominent halos, accompanying putti, or generally anything that would bring to mind divine grandiosity. This is not to say that Caravaggio has made the scene mundane, because it is quite the opposite. By using the ordinary, he has demonstrated the extraordinary. The physical closeness between man and angel, to portray them as equals in this sense, is something completely new to the 17th century. Caravaggio has placed his subjects on the same visual plane, not to diminish or aggrandize them, but instead to highlight a tender intimacy between us and the divine. There is an intrinsic trustworthiness with both of the figures' relaxed postures, the angel's content expression, and St. Matthew's devoted faith in the angel's message. Caravaggio, despite the widespread influence of his art, had this version of his St. Matthew struck down by the church for its, quote, indecorous, unquote, depictions of the Lord. An unrefined, lowly-looking saint, and a quote, sensual angel. He was forced to completely remake the painting in favor of a composition that imposed distance between St. Matthew and the angel, ensuring that the line between them would remain strictly unblurred. High above, the angel is godly and remarkably separate from humanity, while St. Matthew listens from below in the realm of mortals, receiving the angel's heaven-sent words. The repressive ideals of the Council of Trent saw such a relationship, innocent as it may be, to be impermissible. In the final, accepted version, the now imposed physical distance between St. Matthew and the angel calls to mind outdated Renaissance ideals, reflecting the Church's own dogma. The intimacy between man and divinity has been lost. The image now will work only in its tenebrism, yet as emotionally distant and plaything of the Renaissance. In the same vein as Caravaggio's first St. Anthony Angel, almost 25 years later, would Francisco Ribalta create his St. Bernard embracing the crucified Christ, dated 1625 to 1627. St. Bernard was regarded as an extremely pious monk during his life, with one of his writings from his 8th sermon declaring his love and devotion to the Lord. Quote, "How good you are, Lord, to the soul who looks for you. You go before it, you embrace it, you treat it like a spouse, you are its Lord." End quote. The context regarding the specific story which Ribalta chose as his subject goes as such. Quote, "The Lord so cherished St. Bernard that one day when the latter was kneeling before the cross, the crucified Christ stretched out his arm and laid on him, embracing and stroking him most lovingly. Immersed in this ineffable gentleness and deep silence, he united with the Supreme Being in an extremely chaste embrace." As a story of pure adoration and physical intimacy, it is a direct antithesis to the Renaissance beloved tales of intrinsic hierarchy. Here, St. Bernard and Christ face each other with expressions of pure contentment, their limbs relaxed and in embrace. The space they are situated in is unclear, almost dreamlike. St. Bernard seems to melt blissfully to Christ, much like, in St. Bernard's words, a loving spouse. Christ is elevated slightly above the saint, but it does not serve to make Christ look superior, instead emphasizing St. Bernard's veneration and adoration. Dr. Victor Stoikita comments on the equality of their embrace. Quote, "As in many scenes that thematize the mystic union, the naked body is a symbol of the divinity, whereas the body of the holy man is eclipsed by the thick curtain formed by his vestments. The light that holds the two figures in its halo tends, however, to dilute these contrasts by unifying the contours of the bodies and by emphasizing their place on the same level of reality." Ribalta's portrayal of intimacy in their expressions of affection, the mere sensual physical closeness, and the symbolic equality of man and God are all aspects of the visual language which developed in the Council of Trent, as more artists began to reject Renaissance ideals and embrace those of the Baroque. Caravaggio, under the demanding social pressure of the Counter-Reformation, had sown the first seeds for such a new portrayal of man's relationship to divinity, and those seeds were finally able to blossom without constraint in Ribalta's work. This iconographic innovation, however, did not end with Ribalta. Another 20 years later, in 1647, the mercurial, endlessly passionate, and extremely religious John Lorenzo Bernini exemplified the 17th century ideals that would come to replace those of the 16th century. Bernini had been hired by the Cornaro family to decorate their Baroque chapel, leading to the creation of his masterpiece and most controversial work, the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. Here's a familiar passage. The artwork depicts St. Teresa of Avila's transfiguration as recorded by herself in her autobiography. "I saw in his hand a long spear of gold, and at the iron's point there seemed to be a little fire. He appeared to me to be thrusting it at times into my heart, and to pierce my very entrails. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also, and to leave me all on fire with the great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and yet so surpassing with the sweetness of this excessive pain that I could not wish to be rid of it." End quote. In Bernini's sculpture, St. Teresa lies prone in spiritual ecstasy with the angel beside her. A golden shower of light shines above her, the folds of St. Teresa's robe cascading down her body. The angel gazes at her with adoration, arm poised with the arrow as if ready to pierce once more. St. Teresa's expression and body language are crucial to the piece. With her eyes just barely open and her body surrendered to ecstasy, Bernini has chosen to depict her transfiguration as something much closer to orgasmic pleasure, as St. Teresa herself had seemingly described. His intentions with this have been debated for decades, with some scholars such as Burckhardt condemning Bernini's, quote, "scandalous degradation of the supernatural," end quote. Although we may never know decidedly whether he carved the body with pioneeriness in mind, Bernini undoubtedly created one of the most innovative and nuanced Baroque works of visionary experience. Every aspect of the sculpture points towards grandiosity, yet it remains a deeply intimate scene, the rays of gold shine equally over both of them, and the angel seems to be caught in the midst of movement. This creates a sense of anticipation and sensuality in their action that is deeply emblematic of the Baroque, given that patrons frequently sought art that, among many other motives, could be utilized as propaganda. The church needed an art enrapturing enough to urge the viewer to consider the glory of faith, reflected to them on canvas or sculpture. Thus, the artwork made for the Counter-Reformation strove to reach new heights, fully embodied in Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa. His work would forever stand out as an innovation of the iconography visionary experience, utilizing sensuality to highlight the gifts of faith and impress upon its observers the intensity of glimpse of the divine.
Our last speaker for today is Maximilian Young. Maximilian Young is a fourth-year studio art and art history student. In his own painting practice, he has an interest in exploring empathy in the First World through figural painting. In his art historical work, he has an interest in both formal and post-structural analysis of Baroque painting. Maximilian seeks to further expand the analysis of classical painting through his experience as a painter and unique understanding of the figure in combination with contemporary thought regarding communication. He currently interns at the Alban Flaschik Museum and Sculpture Garden as a curatorial and reception intern. He has been the president of the UCS Skateboarding Club for 2 years and has been a history and math tutor for 3 years. He has also been featured in numerous group art shows throughout his high school and college career. In the coming year, he will be going through his graduate school applications and plans to pursue a master's in fine arts with the goal of teaching art at higher education. Let's welcome Max.
How do the great artists, from the Mannerist through the Baroque periods, include themselves in their work? Do they exalt themselves in their supposed virtues? Do they express shame and loathing, self-loathing? They, of course, do both, and it seems that these approaches follow regional trends. During the Mannerist and Baroque periods in Italy and the Netherlandish states, when making biblical history paintings, artists in Italy tended to more morose and self-loathing depictions of themselves in self-portraiture, while artists in Flanders and the Dutch Republic preferred more favorable depictions of themselves when they appeared in their own biblical history paintings. By biblical history paintings, we are referring to the genre of large-scale biblical narrative paintings, which were at the time included with history paintings at the top of the hierarchy of the painting genres. But now, biblical paintings and history paintings are considered separate genres. Throughout this paper, this sort of inclusion of the artist will be referred to as allegorical self-portraiture. It will establish the trends, hallmarks, and potential reasons for this difference between the two painting canons during the Mannerist and Baroque periods. In the waning years of the Italian Renaissance, Michelangelo Baroque was commissioned to paint the back wall of the Sistine Chapel by Pope Clement VII. Michelangelo's Last Judgment, seen here, is, according to most scholars, one of the earliest Mannerist works of art. The space is not divinely ordered. The figures are overly muscular. The disorder present within the work places it squarely outside of the Renaissance and into the Mannerist. Since as its direct predecessor, Mannerism was massively influential for Baroque painting, this paper will also look at Mannerist instances of artists placing themselves in biblical history paintings. The Last Judgment notably features St. Bartholomew carrying his flayed skin in his left hand. There's art of historical consensus that the flayed skin bears Michelangelo's own visage. This paper claims that this self-portrait is a sort of ecclesiastical self-loathing. Michelangelo is upset at his treatment by the clergy overworking him, not allowing him to work on sculpture. And this figure is an expression of that. Beyond the Last Judgment, what other works in the Italian Mannerist period can serve as examples of allegorical self-portraiture, which can help better understand the attitude artists have towards themselves when having self-portraiture in these biblical history paintings. A definite instance of such an inclusion of an allegorical self-portrait within a biblical history painting in the Mannerist Italian canon is Jacopo Pontormo's deposition from the cross of 1528 in the St. Francesca altar piece. On the right-hand side, there's an undeniable self-portrait of Pontormo. The portrait in the deposition piece bears little difference from contemporary portraits of the artist. Could it be claimed that he is portraying himself as a specific biblical character? It could. Many painters before and after Pontormo depicted themselves as figures that were canonically present in Calvary during the Passion. What is he depicting himself as? What is he specifically referencing? There are numerous possibilities, but no clear textual answer. However, formal analysis provides a sufficient amount of evidence for how this works fits into the broader trends. The deposition piece is well known as a sorrowful and morose scene. Pontormo even includes a reference to Michelangelo's Pietà in order to reinforce the sorrow and moroseness in his rendering of Mary Jesus. Pontormo's figure is pushed back in the composition, practically hiding away. He is also in a twisted position, both of which will be further demonstrated as hallmarks of Italian self-portraits within biblical history paintings. The body is in conflict, not able to look away from the agony of the scene, it's still turning from it. There are much more concrete examples of this in Italian art, which can demonstrate how it was used in the late 15th through the 17th century, which this paper will later compare to similar works in the Dutch and Flemish states, in order to demonstrate a clear difference between the Northern European and Italian uses of allegorical self-portraiture within biblical paintings. Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio placed himself in his large-scale biblical history paintings prolifically and consistently demonstrates a contempt for himself in these. There's no shortage of historical accounts regarding his tumultuous and violent life. It's not uncommon for this to lead people to read his overtly violent, high-incidence content as a painter to be reflective of the life he lived. Caravaggio died in 1610 under somewhat unclear circumstances. One of the last works he painted before his mysterious death is Salome with the head of St. John the Baptist, seen here. Salome with the head of St. John the Baptist is exemplary of artists of the period, including their own self-portraits and ecclesiastical, sorrowful positions within their scenes. Caravaggio is known to have used his own face as the model of the beheaded St. John. This is reinforced by accounts that his face was severely disfigured in an attack on his life that occurred while he was on the run in Naples. The nose and face resemble other depictions of Caravaggio at the time as well. It is well known that Caravaggio used his works to gain forgiveness both legally and in the eyes of the church, which were often the same thing. During this period, he produced the aforementioned Salome with the head of St. John the Baptist, as well as David with the head of Goliath. Another scene of decapitation which depicts Caravaggio as the victim of said decapitation. In the David from 1609 to 1610, Caravaggio does not depict his head as the derelict and holy martyr like St. John, but as the Philistine villain Goliath, after his defeat at the hands of a young future King David. In this work, the holy David looks upon the head of Goliath like Caravaggio with disgust, but also a tender pity. The metatextual reading is clear. This is how Caravaggio looks upon and views himself. Compared to his other depiction of the same scene, commonly referred to as the Vienna David, seen here on the right, which is much less psychologically dense. In the Vienna David, David barely even acknowledges the head of Goliath. In the 1609 to 1610 David on the left, David appears to be, in the 1609 to 1610 David, which Caravaggio is the model for, the intimacy is palpable, whereas in the Vienna David, on the right, David appears to be presenting the head to an audience outside of the picture frame. When Caravaggio is the model on the left, he practically begs for forgiveness for his sinful actions. It's important to note the work which became immediately more influential in the Dutch Republic was the earlier David, which had a much shallower sense of shame and violence, likely due to the lack of Caravaggio's self-portrait. See violent violence engraving after Caravaggio's David for an example of this. This is not the only time which Caravaggio's contempt for himself is able to be compared in this manner. Caravaggio painted young Bacchus at least twice in his career. One of these features his own self-portrait, and one features his lover. So one might have come to expect, but the Bacchus which features Caravaggio's face is not a loving nor a lively depiction, while the rendering of his young lover as a Bacchus is lush, lively, hardy, and titillating. Caravaggio painted the self-portrait as Bacchus through 1593 to 1594. On the surface level, it is clear that this portrait is not sentimental, nor does it carry a sense of pride in the subject. Bacchus is pallid and sickly. Lips barely different from the color of the skin, a clear indication of poor health. There's also obvious Freudian reading of the grapes and the peach in the foreground being a sign of castration, but for the purposes of this paper, any direct Freudian or psychoanalytic reading will not be considered. The figure is turned away from what it looks like, similar to another instance of Caravaggio, using allegorical self-portrait to demean himself. This turned figure typically has a connotation of coy flirtation, typical of classical history of biblical paintings in the Baroque and Renaissance period. But this paper contends that Caravaggio uses the figure's twisted, hidden body as a sign of shame in the same way he does in his later martyrdom of St. Matthew. Furthermore, this work can be compared with his slightly later Bacchus, circa 1597 to 1598. This work, which shows Caravaggio's young lover as a model, forms a stark contrast with the self-portrait of the sick Bacchus. In the later Bacchus, the figure is lush, lively, healthy, and inviting. Even the crown of leaves have strong differences. The leaves are alive and large in the later Bacchus, while the earlier leaves with Caravaggio are painted dry, limp, and dying. The obvious sexual implication in the difference of foliage cannot be ignored. When depicting himself on the left, Caravaggio makes the fruit and leaves weak, dry, grasped by death, full of sexual failure. When rendering his lover on the right, he shows the fruit and leaves strong, lively, hurt, ready to perform. The figure also sits in a completely different position, opening up to the audience, inviting them with pleasure and satisfaction. Caravaggio hides himself away from the audience, embarrassed at the state that he is in, while his lover is unabashed in his youthful beauty. There's a clear pattern when Caravaggio uses himself in his work. He uses an allegory to place himself in a biblical history painting as a weak and detestable figure, writhing in its own self-destruction. When he paints the same subject with another model other than himself, there is much more respect and dignity afforded to their depiction. If this dichotomy is visible in his own work, can the archetype be further understood and extrapolated when compared to other artists using allegorical self-portraits that don't communicate a sense of self-loving of the artists? How does Peter Paul Rubens, in his vision of himself, as Longinus in the raising of the cross, compared to Caravaggio's inclusion of himself in the background of the martyrdom of St. Matthew. They have striking contextual differences, perhaps reflective of the artist's respective experiences with faith and the law. But the differences also follow the trends found in the research of his paper. Rubens was a famously faithful and unperturbed individual, never having any documented interactions with the law or getting in any trouble of the sort that Caravaggio had throughout his life. This dichotomy is also present in the representations of self-portraits and scenes of holy figures being killed. In Raising the Cross, seen here, Peter Paul Rubens paints his self-portrait as Longinus, the Roman soldier who was instantaneously converted to Christianity when he saw wine pour out of the wound he gave Christ. The text has a clear indication of the high esteem Rubens held himself in regarding his faith and piety. Caravaggio, as one might have come to expect by now, takes an approach in the opposite direction. Caravaggio, is a non-specific character in the witnessing of the killing of St. Matthew. His body is turned away, seemingly in retreat, while his face cannot look away at the horror and violence which he is bearing witness to. In the Raising of the Cross, Rubens, as Longinus, is in close proximity to Christ in the center panel, moving towards the light, and also towards Christ. Rubens depicts himself as a new yet steadfast and devoted follower of Christ in the path set by the Church that is perfectly aligned with the anagogical axis of the painting. Caravaggio's self-insert is nearly the opposite in all its aspects. His figure is mostly hidden, the body is twisted. It is in deep conflict with the shame and horror he is witnessing. Rubens exhausts his own righteousness at every possible turn, while Caravaggio tears himself and his faith to shreds. The split between the two, as stated previously, is indicative of larger trends within the two regions of European painting, the Mannerist and the Baroque. We will now look at other artists that solidify these trends. Since the Dutch and Flemish states had less of an appetite for large-scale biblical paintings compared to the Italians, there will be fewer works discussed from the Flemish and Dutch canons. We will now look at Rembrandt van Riemen's Raising of the Cross from 1632. The difference is eminently clear from the previous Italian paintings we've discussed. The center figure wearing a turban in the work, which clearly depicts Rembrandt himself. This is an unassailable self-portrait, easily confirmed by the plethora of others Rembrandt made himself. Rembrandt's figure is perfectly upright and placed in the center of the composition. Typically, in the Italian scenes of similar subject, the artist hides themselves where they're placed in the character of a holy individual or not. Compare Rembrandt's placing of himself as an overseer of Christ crucifixion to that of Caravaggio simply witnessing the killing of St. Matthew. There's a stark difference between the two. The figure remains untwisted, confronting both subject and viewer with booming confidence, despite committing an act of murder upon the Son of God himself. While Caravaggio cowers and appears to be at war just seeing the murder of an apostle, Rembrandt presents himself as an incredibly authoritative holy image. Now, this paper will provide one more comparison before it concludes. Another beloved painter from Flanders, which follows in this trend, is Anthony van Dyck. The self-portrait can be found in the 1635 Lamentation in the upper right-hand side of the painting as the angel. The portrait on the angel bears a striking resemblance to portraits done of Van Dyck in his younger years. Look at his portraits from 1617 to 1619 for comparison of the fullness of the cheek, the curl pattern of the hair, and the color of the hair. They all match nearly word for one. In the Lamentation, the angel is somewhat pushed back in the composition in both light and placement, which does differ slightly from what one would expect from the allegorical self-portrait from Flanders and the Dutch Republic at this time. However, it still follows enough of the other hallmarks that have been established thus far to contribute to the difference between Netherlandish and Italian subjects for this architect. For example, the figure reaches out and retains a line of action free from tension and conflict. The torso and head follow the same movement with the traces of divinity and hope to the insertion of Van Dyck's self-portrait in the Lamentation. The Strauss comparisons are similar to Symphony of Cross, painted in 1528, which was previously discussed. Latourneau's self-portrait is tense and placed on the ground receding in space while the Van Dyck moves towards the action. Not only does the shift of meaning and the connotation of the inclusion of the self-portrait itself, it shifts the entire mood of the painting. If there's such a clear difference between these paintings, what can be said about the specific hallmarks of Netherlandish and Italian portraits, self-portraits within biblical history paintings that have been established thus far. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Jacopo Pontormo, and Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio all painted examples of self-portraits in biblical paintings which demonstrate the Italian preference for depicting feelings of self-loathing and shame. It is important to look at the similarities between these works and to create a standard which can be applied to other potential examples of this architect from the research. First, it would be useful to look and see if there are any similarities between the figures themselves. Do a formal analysis. Do they turn away from the viewer? Where do the eyes go? Is there tension in the stance, etc.? The most consistent aspect of these figures in the work is a twisting of the main body from the viewer and such main subject of the painting, also known as a figura serpentinata, a serpentine figure. This is present in Pontormo's deposition, Caravaggio's St. Bacchus, and also his self-portrait in the Martyrdom of St. Matthew. They all feature a figure which looks in the opposite direction that its body faces. This, of course, evokes notions of internal struggle or turmoil. Another consistency throughout the visual style of the portraits is indications of violence, disfigurement, and poor health. The obvious instances of Caravaggio's two paintings where he's portrayed as a severed head being presented in some capacity immediately come to mind. There's also of note that in Italian and St. John the Baptist, Caravaggio goes further, paints subtle scars and disfigurements on the face, possibly reflecting on the recent attack he survived in Naples. The sense of violence and disfigurement can be seen in Michelangelo's Last Judgment, when Michelangelo paints his self-portrait in the flayed skin of St. Bartholomew. The violence is obvious in that one. Once again, poor health is visible in our Caravaggio work, with the eponymous self-portrait as Bacchus figure. Beyond the clear indications, physical indications that show a lack of satisfaction or great frustration with the self, there are contextual clues within the allegories themselves. Michelangelo's no contempt for the clergy overworking him and preventing him from working on sculpture, which he was passionate about. Caravaggio included himself running away from the scene of a murder in the Martyrdom of St. Matthew, considering his run-ins with the law, specifically with murder. Pontormo's twisted figure in the deposition of St. Francesca altarpiece all demonstrated contextual evidence for how Italian artists showed an amount of shame, frustration, and self-loathing within allegorical self-portraits in biblical history paintings. And these compare to those pieces previously discussed from Flanders in the Dutch Republic. As shown throughout this paper, placing themselves in a biblical history painting, Italian artists have a clear predilection for the morose and to depict themselves as shameful creatures cowering from righteousness and faith, while painters of the Flemish and Dutch Baroque had a greater preference to depict themselves as men of virtue and faith, even when they placed themselves in the stead of pagans and enemies of the church. The final question to address and provide a potential explanation for is why is there a clear separation between the two regional painting disciplines? What could cause such a stark yet specific difference between these cultures? Is it some inexplicable and miraculous cultural divide? No, of course not. Those don't exist. Is it the influence of the church and its greater influence over Italian artists and how they would have gained work and commissions and the church being a greater factor in the economic driving force of the art world? Yes, that is one of the most likely explanations. Flanders in the Dutch Republic at the time had what's known as an open market system, which meant the artists typically did business based on selling works to merchants and royals rather than the main driving economic force of the art world being commissions from members of the clergy or businessmen decorating their private chapels. The difference in the art market is most likely responsible, as it was in Italy, The difference in the art market is most likely responsible for this cultural gap between Netherlandish and Italian history painters of the time. Potential avenues of further research in this subject could look into the connection between artist status within their respective cultures and how that affects the tendencies even further. Other European states during the Baroque and Mannerist period should also be included in further research into the subject. But the main reason for these trends appears to be resulting from the differing economic systems for the art market and the presence of the Catholic Church. Now, there's a stark difference between how Italian artists and Netherlandish artists tended to include their self-portraits into biblical history paintings. Within the Dutch and Flemish traditions, likely to a lesser influence of the Catholic Church, painters tended to present themselves as more virtuous and authoritative over the image, possibly in order to appeal to potential buyers and merchants and gain work. While in Italy, at the same time, artists tended to engage their allegorical self-portraits with shame, cowardice, and even vitriol at themselves. Thank you.
their own view. I'm always a little bit hesitant because so much of this is, for lack of a better explanation, a sort of contemporary Caucasian reading back into the situational awareness of someone that we, do you know what I mean? So is there that's an actual question, I don't know if there is, I don't know what that material, but I guess there must be something. My own question for you about Teresa Vandegat is, who decided she's disabled? Yes, she has migraines. Well, no, but I'm just saying, there's some references in there to her. Because then I'm going to say the same thing, right? The comparison with maybe Hildegard Bingen, right? Who also had ecstatic visions and this sort of ferocious headaches and things. So I don't know where it comes.
Yeah.
Right outside of sorry, but there's something there about the same for you with perceptions of her.
I say that, I say seemingly, like she seemingly described her now like a pleasure.
Yeah. But yeah, no, all very thoughtful. I would say, presentation-wise, let's not race to the end. I know it's uncomfortable to be up there under the gaze of everyone. Everybody take a, just like, you guys know that. Take a breath, drop your shoulders, lower your heart rate, lower your blood pressure, take a nice deep breath. Only because there's such value in what you're saying. If we're struggling to hear you, either articulate it, we're struggling just to sort of hear you. We want to hear every word you've got for us. It's a practice when you do this for all of you, right? Because you're going to do it all again many times, right? That you take a breath, slow down, really enunciate, because we're so busy trying to, you know what it's like trying to take notes from me, right? That's sort of, right? When I really get a roll, I'm supposed to pass you along, I really love to know, but I can't. So we're just like, thank you.
Okay, all right, sure. Yes, to echo Dr. Zava's comments, congratulations to all of you. It's a very daunting experience, so there's a lot to take away from this. But thank you for presenting and sharing your resources. I would echo the points of disability. Disability, if we think about today, the notion of the social model of disability, that it is not the same over time. So in the 17th century, being a dwarf, being a person with dwarfism was not considered a disability, right? So the club-footed boy, yes, he was, hunchback and vegan. So so maybe it's different. It's certainly from our standpoint, but I think there is a danger of trans-historical putting our values and judgments on another time period. So that's where I think the primary sources are very helpful. I think also all three of you did a really nice job of giving us kind of a survey across artists, but I think if you would limit the scope of your research, you can easily give a 20-minute talk, write a 25, 40-page article on one work, on one small thing that will really can extend the scholarship and give us more insight. So I think sometimes depth over breadth could be something to think about. And then I would say along those lines, for you, Maximilian, I think you're getting caught up on this biblical historical meanings. I wasn't sure exactly what you were saying, and I think it's because you're thinking of a hierarchy of the genres, which doesn't exist at the time that you're writing it up. That's a 17th century French Academy construct. So those are biblical meanings, right? They're about biblical subjects. So, right, and the reason it comes about later, too, and becomes important when we kind of drill you down the hierarchy of genres is, again, because of the importance of the new figures in the French Academy. Also, then a little bit later than that, the importance of what are we going to do with contemporary history paintings? Will those be considered important? They're newsy, right? Not looking to the past. And that's why when we talk about history paintings later being biblical and theological, but that doesn't exist at the time period you're writing about. So you don't have to engage in it, right? That's like that trans-historical thing. The other issue, I think, for you is that Flanders is not part of the Netherlands. But you can't love Rubens with program. You can't call for another because it's not right. That was enough for me. Great job, everyone.
Yeah, okay.
And I'm largely just going to piggyback on what Sara said. But for you, Sarah, I know for me personally, early on when I was giving presentations, I would literally write in my script, slow down, pause, or I would put these really big breaks that would force me to stop and take a breath. So just from a really practical standpoint, because your written paper, which it was really, really great, really excellent, great to dig into, and I just needed to hear you slow down some of those points in the presentation, because I know how great the paper was. And so I just wanted to say, just from someone who often has to give a presentation, sometimes we have to put those reminders to ourselves in the script just to help us. So there's that. But and then Francesca, it's interesting because hearing you and Max, there were certain things about Max's presentation I thought really benefited yours, and that is, looking at things from a regional standpoint. Because one of the things that stood out to me in hearing your talk and reading your paper was, again, I want to point out, maybe narrowing in, because I think that the conflation of mental disability, physical disability, neurological disability, I think honing in on one thing would really kind of help you sort of think more, not necessarily broadly, but I think, for instance, I felt like your paper was strongest when you were sort of dabbling, not so much with disability, but with this idea of disfigurement. Because that's something that I thought was a really kind of interesting thread. And so to me, to add the ecstasy of the St. Teresa at the end kind of felt out of place, because I felt that what you're setting up is and I think that might help too with this whole idea of disability and its changing definitions over time. Because to hone in specifically, you're looking at organism, you're looking at what it means to be clubfoot, thinking about the way that disfigurement might be rendered. And then also to that point, when I was hearing you sort of talk, I wondered if there were differences in how different countries and cultures viewed the idea of disfigurement and disability. Because, Max brings up this difference regionally, and I thought that might be an interesting thing to consider as well. Yeah. And so, and then the other thing that I think would be really helpful too, Francesca, is that, we all know that art doesn't exist in a vacuum, but it's interesting to me when I was listening to you talk specifically about the Baroque, I was like, oh, well, how does it compare to the period before? How does it compare to the Renaissance? How does it compare to, like thinking about how, if you're specifically talking about this one period, how disability might have looked over time, sort of looking at that conversation with comparison before and after might be really helpful too. And again, that is honing in on one particular aspect to do so. And then for Max, I really did, I liked the fact that you were thinking regionally, but to the point that was made earlier, I couldn't help but think, well, just the idea of the mea culpa, the self-punishment, whether that whole idea is different regionally as well. Because the one thing I really was hoping I could get into is the differences in religious practice of Catholicism on a regional level. And so that was something that stood out to me as I was listening to you. But overall, great job. Yay! You're done.
On purpose to not be referring to people with dwarfism. And so we say people with dwarfism rather than say dwarfs anyway, because you want to use people first language to center the person, right? It's a medical condition, it's not the identity. But that is why he calls them dwarfs, to be magical creatures, right? And so that's the pearl. And I think it's a great illustration as well of regional differences, language changing over time, and all of those ideas. Okay, that's
Other questions or comments from the audience?
Your audience won't always be just PhDs in art history.
And there's a student at SMU that's finishing up her dissertation on her conclusion was, right?
Yeah, this was definitely my very first touch on disability studies, but I think it did open up a lot of doors, and I think it'll even pursue future research projects for sure.
And I should add that you won yesterday for the poster presentation. You were an award for her disability in the Baroque poster, and she's working with Dr. Watson on her honors and graduate thesis.
It's not really a question, but I guess the book discussion for Max, if you didn't come across, he's an art historian who wrote a text called The Self-Aware Image, and he talks a lot about like this period in time of the Baroque, and you see like those like cross-regionalism as well, of like the north, and then like all sorts of stuff. So when we were talking about, self-portraiture and what that can convey, I think the self-aware image would be really a great source if you're wanting to get that more.
I just kind of want to say for Sara that I thought it was really impressive when you started us off with that Renaissance example, about talking about the distance, and then you switched to, what is it, Caravaggio's. I thought that was a really striking way to make your example, felt in the presentation. I literally wrote it down that it was staggering to see how different it was. So I thought that was great.